speaker is Luís Rocha. He's professor at Indiana University and director of the Computational Biology Collaboratorium at Instituto Gulbenkian Ciência here in Portugal. And he's going to talk about cybernetics of complexity.
Okay, so thanks. So I'm Luís Rocha. I am at Indiana University at the Instituto Gulbenkian Ciência here. So this conference is about evolutionary patterns. So instead of talking about my work, I decided to talk about more of a philosophical nature about what evolutionary patterns are. So this is basically a talk I was giving a lot last year on the Turing centennial. So it has to do with Alan Turing and how it relates to evolution. But here, because we only have 20 minutes, this is usually a talk, I'm going to go through the skeleton of the talk, and I'm not going to go into detail into the arguments, which we can always do whenever you want and when we write. So the point of the conference evolutionary patterns, the word pattern is a word that people looked a lot in the 20th century. In particular, in the area that I work in the area of complex systems. That's what we do, is to try to find patterns. And particularly what we do is try to find general patterns that we can say, that we call general systems. So patterns that occur in different types of systems. Well, a social system, a biological system, and so forth. And so, the people that came with that idea early on in the middle of the 20th century were the cyberneticians. And this was the field called cybernetics, where people were trying to look at different fields with the same topic. And one of them, as we shall see, was Alan Turing. So I will go into, just very briefly, talking about a little bit of what cybernetics was about. Cybernetics was born in these conferences founded by the Josiah Macy conferences in New York City. And this is basically a post-war event in where people from many fields come to work together. And so largely inspired, these people were very inspired by two things. First, Alan Turing, and we will see that later, namely the idea of a Turing machine. But also the other paper that made everybody really look at this was a paper by McCulloch and Pitts, in which they showed that you could make any Turing function, so any function that was computable, could be done by a network, well, not a little, but a network of simple Boolean switches similar to the ones that Claudine talked about before, in which so if any computable function could be done by that network of simple elements, as long as it has loops, if we want to get more clear on that, then the brain, cognition, the mind, could be explained by automata. So that was a big thing, that we could suddenly get inside the brain and explain mind via a very simple automata. So to see how important this was, right at the middle of the photo for the conference, you have Warren McCulloch, center right in the middle, just to see how important that paper was. But many other people from other fields. You had Margaret Mead from the social sciences. You have Claude Shannon, basically one of the fathers of computer science and information theory. All of these people came together. The name itself was coined by Norbert Wiener in his book Cybernetics. Norbert Wiener was sort of a star scientist of the time that everybody would talk about in the papers. He was a child prodigy and a professor of mathematics at MIT. And the term comes from there. So as I said, the big thing was that we could explain all these patterns in all sorts of systems, from biology to the social, including the mind, by looking at a couple of patterns that they were very interested in. It was feedback, networks, and control. Those were the three big things that cyberneticians dealt with, and so did we. Just to show that Turing was a cybernetician, in Britain, at the same time, there was this ratio club, ratio in the sense of reasoning, that was done by the British cyberneticians like Ross Ashby and Gray Walter and Alan Turing, and I'm not going to go into detail, but just to show that Turing was indeed a cybernetician. He's right there in these meetings. What do we deal with? So right now we call cybernetics systems, first became system science, and now we call it complex systems or complex system science, if you want to know. So basically what we look is at general patterns that we call general principles of organization or general systems. We look at patterns that repeat in different systems and try to formalize them a little bit like physicists do. So in our view of science, science is two-dimensional, where you have science dealt by the subject that you study, that we call the thinghood, a term coined by Robert Rosen. For instance, so you study biology, you study the specific life as we know it. If you study physics, you study the laws of physics as we know, etc. And then you have these orthogonal disciplines that deal with all of these. And the typical disciplines of complex systems would be things like machine learning, network science, dynamical systems theory. All of these are disciplines that can be applicable to any one of these other systems. We call this the systemhood disciplines, but I'm not going to go into the details here. Just to say that it's very interdisciplinary. As an example of a recent general system, a general pattern of this area of research that I'm talking about, you can think, for instance, of the Barabasi-Albert model of networks, of these power law distributions that people have been written in the past decade or more about, that they occur, whether it's protein networks, where the airport networks, the one on top is protein interaction networks. Here you have the internet, patterns of transmission of HIV. Over there you have Twitter feeds between John McCain and Lady Gaga. There's a lot of things here that they all follow this pattern. So this is a general pattern. It's a general system that we see in many systems. So since this conference was about patterns, I decided to talk a little about what I think is the key pattern of evolution that these people hit upon. So Turing was a cybernetician. He was very interested in control, information, general principles, computation, and networks. So let's see how this relates to biocomplexity, which is one of the labels I have in my talk. So the key paper for this, for us to understand this, and I'm not going to detail, is this paper where Turing was dealing with the decision problem, in which we came up with a mathematical construct called the Turing machine. This is not a physical machine, but it's a machine that we think of in mathematical terms. So you can think of an automaton, a simple computational device that is in some state, and then has a program that tells it, if you are in this state and you read some other information, some other symbol from this infinite external paper tape, that's what we thought, then you go into another state. So the program tells it how to do that. The interesting thing about this machine is that the machine can read another program from this tape and reprogram itself. So that would be a universal Turing machine, and this is the key insight that probably we have to get from here, is that the machine can eat its own tail, as it were. You can store an entire other machine such as this in this infinite tape, and it can read it and become that machine, all right, and become something else. So that's a very important thing. So the way we can do this is because any machine can be written onto this tape by a process called Gödelization that had come from Gödel, but I'm not going to go talk about those here. The key thing, that's why I color-coded this insight, the general pattern, the general principle that we will see throughout the talk in evolution here, also see, is that Turing identified something, a distinction between numbers that mean things, that we can call data, and numbers that do things, that can be programs. They're all numbers written on this tape, but at a point, data is just stored there, but it can mean something. It can be the value of a variable, or it's a number that does something, that is the program that constructs it. And we will see what I mean by this. In recent books last year there were a lot of books about Turing. I just have a quote here from Dyson. Again, the point of the Turing machine, the fundamental process problem of concept in computation is the separation between memory and code. The separation of when a number is memory and when a number is code. And that dual role of information is essential for understanding the principles of Turing. This is just another example of the machine that I'm going to go really fast. Just the point here, there's an artist here that depicted this, that the machine can then encode another machine that becomes the new machine and so forth. Now, Turing didn't invent this. I have a quote here right from Turing himself. And he says, Turing on programs of numbers being used as instructions. Says Babbage, Charles Babbage, in the 19th century had all the essential ideas and planned such a machine, which he never built, that it was called the analytical engine, which he did after the difference engine. So this machine has a few interesting things, and one of them that Turing was very influenced by is that it separated the memory store from a central processing unit, what we call today a CPU, but Babbage called a mill. So these two roles of information coexisted on this machine, the memory and the process, the program. It could do a number of things that are very interesting, like it had variables and so forth. But one thing that I would like to highlight about this machine right here is that you can clearly see the separation physically. The way they envisioned it was him and Ada Lovelace, that I'll talk a little next. This machine would operate with punch cards. Here you're seeing Turing's infinite tape in paper. And they had two different types of punch cards. Some of them was for data, some of that were for programs. Some of them was to store the program of what the machine would do, and the other would be just the data for that. All right, so for instance, the Boolean network that describes Drosophila that Claudine would be there, would have the program for how to deal with Boolean networks, and here you'd have the data that feeds that particular model. So they saw this separation. This is in the Science Museum in London, I believe, that they have this of how it would be, this machine, that was clearly identified, this role of the two were separated. So here, this was all a collaboration with Ada Lovelace, which was the daughter of Lord Byron, and that was a tremendous mathematician that worked with Babbage at this time. So what I want to highlight from here is that this interesting design of the separation, first of taking this infinite tape, this thing we call Turing tape, outside of the machine, and then the separated two roles of information. Interestingly, they got this idea from something before them, the Jacquard loom, a French loom that could make any stitching pattern. So they saw this in a London Science exhibit, and they were really fascinated, and Babbage abandoned the difference engine and started thinking about the analytical engine once they saw this machine that clearly had a separated tape that could then allow it to compute, if you want, to make any stitching. So ideas never come. All geniuses have ideas that they take from somewhere else. So the point here is that you did have this separation between variable and operational cards. By the way, Ada Lovelace is the first that uses the term variable. And so we still use it in computer science. So again, we have this distinction between numbers that mean things and numbers that do things. Okay, there's a book that came out a couple years ago in which this is very well described by James Gleick, called The Information. So if you want to know a lot more about this, I strongly recommend that book. So a person that was maximally important for this that comes next is John von Neumann, and that he saw the power of Turing machines and was one of the people that included Turing that decided to make such a machine in the 20th century. Again, he wanted to find a way to implement this separation between the two roles of information, memory and code. And this is what he had to physically do. How do you do this thing in machines that now we carry everywhere? So what we call, all machines right now still have what we call the von Neumann architecture that has this separation between a central process unit and memory, except the memory, instead of being like Turing machine that is a tape, it's a two-dimensional addressable memory. So every memory has a particular location that the CPU knows where it is. So that's what we call the von Neumann architecture that all of these machines still use. Okay, so again, we have this distinction between numbers that mean things and numbers that do things and how to do this. So there's two books that if you want to know more about this, that I recommend. The recent one by George Dyson called Turing Cathedral is really all about von Neumann, despite the title. And there's an earlier one by my colleague at Bloomington, Bill Asprey, about the biography of John von Neumann. All right, so von Neumann then, using very inspired, in addition to computers, he was very interested in evolutionary patterns, von Neumann. So one of the things that he noticed is I make machines, I make these great machines, but every machine that I make decays in complexity. How come life increases in complexity? What is the secret of life that makes it that the second law of thermodynamics doesn't seem to apply to it, that it can increase in complexity? So he came up, how can I make a machine that could forevermore increase in complexity? So he came up with this is just, I'm not going to go into the details here, I don't have time for that, with a set of cellular automata that could do the self-replication, a machine that could replicate itself. And to do that, he took the idea of Turing, the Turing machine, and he came up with 3 different automata. Each one does a different thing. You have a machine that is basically a Turing machine that, given a description, a tape of any other machine, can produce that machine. So if you give it the program, it will make it. You have another machine, which is called the universal copier, that copies any description that you give it, but it doesn't matter what it's encoded in that. So it does not convert the program to a machine. It just copies it. And then you have another machine, which today we would call an operative system, that is something that manipulates all this information and passes it to the appropriate components at the appropriate time. It's still very important, as if I have time, I'll tell you a little about it. But in biology, it happens all the time. So the way this works is C gives a description to B. Here we assume that the machine, the description gets destroyed every time it's read. It produces 3 copies of that. And then one of these is given to the universal constructor A. When you give it to the universal constructor, it builds an automaton exactly like the construction. And then separately, C passes another one like this, another copy of the description. So this whole can keep on doing what this other one did before, and that keeps on going. So we found a machine that can self-replicate this way, and this is all mathematically shown. Key insights here is that you have information in these 2 roles. The role of construction, in which it is interpreted, as we computer scientists call it. This machine interprets the machine, and this other, the information, and this one only copies the information uninterpreted. So here, the insight that he got from Turing was there's these 2 roles of information. Now, 3 more minutes? Okay, I'm in trouble. So let me go. So then he added another thing that we could call the rest of the phenotype of this automaton, which is you have an automaton D around here that does everything else not essential for self-replication. So you can have a body that has arms, that does a lot of things, and this is what selection can act upon. So the point here is that then if you mutate D into D prime, if you mutate in the description but not in the object itself, the next time this replicates, the organism or the automaton will have those accumulated changes. Okay? So basically, here he came up with a system, a general principle, a general pattern of what we call open-ended evolution. This system can keep on evolving and coming up with a new D can change forever given some fitness pressure. So a few interesting things about this, and we can talk about this in more details later, and I've been talking about this at least for 15 years in different papers. This is how biocomplexity can be generated. A few interesting things to look at this from a certain side is that biology, in this view, is a subcase of this larger science we could call informatics, the science of information. That the kind of biological evolution that we have is an instance of this general principle of evolution, of this pattern that can occur, and indeed does occur, including in social systems that we already discussed a little today. There's a quote here from James Gleick in which this is highlighted, but I'm going to go further with that. So one of the big things about von Neumann, let me at least address this I think it's a fairly new insight, was that people always say von Neumann came up with this before the DNA was discovered. And it's true. What we mean by that is von Neumann came up with this before the structure of DNA molecule was known, that it was by Watson and Crick. We did they already did know that DNA was the carrier of information. But people were not very attuned to that. They didn't want to accept that DNA was the carrier of information, and I can tell a little more about that. One of the reasons is that molecular biology, as we know it, was very influenced by this man, Schrodinger, who came up with this book, What is Life?, that attracted a lot of top physicists into biology that eventually created molecular biology. And one of the things that he had in which he was wrong about was that information, the genetic inheritance, would come by something that he called an aperiodic crystal. Basically, Schrodinger postulated that there would be a molecule, a set of biochemical constituents that were at once the information and its own replicator, that basically could do catalysis and information transmission at the same time. And people were looking for that molecule for a long time. But the point but he was wrong. The way biology does it, it's not by having a molecule that has both roles, but it's by this encoded information system that von Neumann came at independently. So if you don't believe me, I have a quote here from Sidney Brenner, who actually I brought here to this foundation to do a talk on Turing late last year during the centennial. And this comes from this paper, in which it says, Turing invented the stored program computer, and von Neumann showed that the description is separate from the universal constructor. This is not trivial. Physicist Schrodinger confused the program and the constructor in his book, in which he saw chromosomes as architect's plan and builder's craft in one. This is wrong. The code script contains only a description of the executive function, not the function itself. So if you just allow me a couple more minutes to say how this idea that is wrong still permeates a lot of science, and it still leads a lot of people to not quite understand the key computational general principle of life. So, for instance, in biology itself, people took a long time to accept that DNA was the carrier of information, and basically comes from Griffith's experiment in 1928 all the way to the Avery's experiment in the 1940s that you actually show that DNA is the locus of information transmission. And after even this experiment showed that it took about 10 years before biologists fully accepted DNA. And the reason for that is DNA is the most passive of biochemical memories. It doesn't react with anything. And they never expected, looking back at how Schrodinger did it, that the molecule that carried information was so unreactive. You wanted a crystal that was reactive. But the point of DNA is that it's a tape. The point of DNA is that something that is very stable to store information, which is why we do here this thing. The same thing, for instance, in artificial life, people have been looking for decades about forms of life as it could be, but they always try to reinvent Schrodinger, for instance. Langton, with his self-reproducing loops, really think that what's important about life is reproduction, but it's not this separation of the two roles of encoded information. And we could discuss this in a lot of more details. A lot of other experiments in artificial life of self-replication have to do with finding structures. These are Hodlipson's group robots that reproduce and are basically an aperiodic crystal a la Schrodinger. The idea of the encoded information a la von Neumann has not really been completely accepted everywhere. And to just give me one more minute to say, one of the things, for instance, that I really love about Venter's experiment with the synthetic genome is that it shows how von Neumann was right. You may not agree that it's the creation of artificial life. In fact, if you see von Neumann, you immediately see that it isn't. But what he did here by plotting this in terms of von Neumann is that we changed simply the description. He gets an organism, changes the DNA artificially, in the description, produces, after several generations, a different phenotype that is the target phenotype that he encoded here. So in a sense, Venter's experiment basically validates and we can discuss this, validates this from a biological point of view. Biology is always full of these things. For instance, this came out a couple of weeks ago in Science, the idea that there's tons of viral genomes encoded in the human genome. For instance, 8% of human DNA is retroviral DNA. It's a Turing machine written inside another Turing machine all over. In fact, there's more viral DNA in our genome than the proteome, the amount of DNA that encodes the proteins of your own body. So the tape is constantly being hijacked for other machines to write themselves onto it. So you can see this over and over and over in this pattern. So if you allow me just to finalize this, one key important thing, I'm going to bypass all the biological evidence of this, ranging from RNA editing and so forth, but I want at least to say this about the concept of memes, because it was important, I think, also for the social sciences. So one of the key ideas, like Richard Dawkins comes about his conception of gene and meme, in my view, just to tell the story short, is a throwback to Schrodinger. The idea that he has of meme, or indeed of gene itself, is that there is a replicator. And don't take that from me. In his own book in 1986, he uses the word crystal, straight from Schrodinger to describe what he thinks, carved in tablets of crystal. So the idea of meme is basically this very disembodied idea that you have a molecule that it's at once information and replicator. It's sort of this idea that hasn't quite seen that there is a separation between the tape and the information. And so we could go into more detail about this, but I will just finish. This is indeed the last one. This principle at play in society is very important. So I leave you with something that I like to have people think about. We cannot think of a single human society capable of making sophisticated machines and sophisticated institution that does not have a writing system. They have the same brains, they have the same bodies, they have the same genomes. But until societies have a separate tape, a separate writing system, you cannot find anyone that has inheritable institutions as the constitution that Sven just talked about. We don't have anybody that can make a building of more than 2 or 3 stories. And so this is just to show this principle of complexity, of generating complexity, until you have the symbolic external memory, does not manifest itself, and we can see it replicated and replicated, etc. So I'll end here, and I'm sorry that I took a little longer to go over this. So, thank you.